Welcome back, everyone. Ready to journey back in time with me today?
Always up for a good history deep dive.
Perfect. Because we're heading to the late 19th century, to the heart of the Lakota people's story.
Ah, a pivotal and often tragic period.
Exactly. We're focusing on the events surrounding the death of Sitting Bull and, of course, the Wounded Knee Massacre.
Drawing insights, I believe, from an episode of the Rest is History podcast.
You got it. And one of the things that struck me right off the bat was this quote they opened with, an editorial published just after Sitting Bull died.
Oh, that's right. By L. Frank Baum, of all people.
Yep, the Wizard of Oz guy.
Yeah.
He calls Sitting Bull this incredible warrior, but then says, let's just annihilate the rest of the Indians. Kind of jarring, right?
It is. But it really highlights the prevailing attitude towards Native Americans back then, this weird mix of fascination and fear.
Which ultimately led to some pretty horrific outcomes.
Sadly, yes.
So we've got Sitting Bull, this legendary figure living on a reservation, his power fading.
He seemed really conflicted about assimilation.
Totally. And then, into this already complex situation, walks Mrs. Weldon.
The Swiss woman, utterly enamored with Lakota culture.
Right. Moves in with Sitting Bull, brings her 12-year-old son along.
It was a bit of a romanticized view of Native American culture, I think, that some Europeans had back then.
Definitely. And she even warned Sitting Bull about the ghost dance movement. Said it would be used against him.
Which, of course, it was. The ghost dance offered this glimmer of hope to the Lakota, a vision of a world where their land was restored, the buffalo returned.
It was their way of resisting, pushing back against being forced to assimilate.
And that terrified the U.S. government. They saw it as a threat, a potential uprising.
Sitting Bull was a bit cautious about the ghost dance, though.
He didn't experience the visions he was known for during those dances. His influence was waning.
Some historians even think he might have embraced it as a last-ditch effort to hold on to power.
It's possible. But remember, Sitting Bull was also a pragmatist. He knew the U.S. government held the cards, that armed resistance might be futile.
He was walking a tightrope, trying to find a way for his people to survive.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, you've got Indian agent McLaughlin viewing Sitting Bull as this huge threat to his control.
Fueled by paranoia and prejudice.
Big time. And he decides to use the Lakota police, the Metal Breasts, to arrest Sitting Bull. Talk about irony.
Lakota warriors, turned policemen, used to control their own people.
It's heartbreaking. The podcast describes these Lakota policemen gathering the night before the arrest, sharing war stories from when they fought against the very army they now served.
Torn between two worlds.
Then, before dawn, on December 14th, they ride out to Sitting Bull's cabin in freezing rain.
A recipe for disaster.
And inside the cabin, we see this clash between the personal and the political playout. Sitting Bull's son, Crowfoot, calls him a coward for submitting to arrest.
Forcing Sitting Bull to confront his own legacy.
Such a powerful moment.
It really highlights the impossible choices the Lakota faced. Resist and likely die, or assimilate and lose their way of life.
And then in a flash, it all changes. A shot rings out. Whether it was an accident or not, we still don't know. But Bullhead, the Lakota police leader, is hit.
And as he falls, he shoots a Sitting Bull in the chest. Another officer shoots him in the head.
A brutal end for a man who had become a symbol of resistance.
And the tragedy doesn't stop there. Crowfoot, who just moments ago challenged his father, is also killed.
He begs for his life, but they club him, shoot him, and toss his body out of the cabin.
Just horrific.
And Sitting Bull's body is buried in a pauper's grave. No ceremony, no prayers. The Lakota police who died in the shootout get full military honors.
The ultimate display of power and disrespect.
It's chilling. His cabin was even sold and put on display at the Chicago World's Fair.
Sitting Bull's death cabin, they called it.
They even staged reenactments.
Exploiting their tragedy for entertainment.
It just shows how deeply ingrained these attitudes were, how they permeated every aspect of society.
And those attitudes, unfortunately, didn't disappear overnight. They still echo in our world today.
Sitting Bull's death sent shockwaves through the Lakota community.
For some, like Gall and his followers who'd chosen assimilation, there's a sense of relief.
But for many, it was a devastating loss.
The end of an era.
Sitting Bull was more than just a leader. He was a symbol of their culture, their way of life.
His death had to have been a source of immense grief and fear.
And it sets the stage for the tragedy that unfolds at Wounded Knee.
The final, brutal chapter in this story.
But before we dive into that, it's important to acknowledge the weight of this history, the pain and suffering the Lakota endured.
These aren't just stories. They are real lives lost, a culture shattered.
We need to remember that.
So as we move towards Wounded Knee, we need to dig deeper into the ghost dance movement.
You mentioned it frightened the U.S. government, but it was a spiritual practice, right? What made it so threatening?
Well, put yourself in the shoes of the Lakota back then. Your way of life, everything you know, is being torn apart. Land taken, buffalo gone, forced onto reservations, the ghost dance. It offered hope, a vision of their world restored.
A powerful form of resistance, then. A rejection of what was being forced upon them.
Exactly. And for the U.S. government, that was terrifying. A unified Native American uprising was their worst nightmare. They had to crush it before it could take hold.
And Sitting Bull's death, as we discussed, kind of sets the stage for what happens next. His followers, terrified, flee the reservation.
Many of them joined Bigfoot. He was known for being more peaceful. They tried to reach the Pine Ridge Reservation, hoping Red Cloud would offer protection. But fear took over, and they decided to surrender to the Army instead.
It's December, freezing cold. They're fleeing for their lives with barely any supplies. The desperation. It's hard to even imagine.
The podcast really paints that picture. Exhausted, hungry, carrying the weight of Sitting Bull's death. Truly heartbreaking.
And then, to make matters worse, they surrendered to the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment. Talk about pouring gasoline on a fire.
The historical baggage there is immense. Those soldiers, they grew up on stories of Custer's last stand, driven by this thirst for revenge, this deep-seated fear of the savage Lakota.
So you have this incredibly volatile situation. Desperate Lakota, surrounded by soldiers who are basically seeking retribution for a past they didn't even live.
And to add to the tension, many of those soldiers were drinking, bragging about taking scalps for Custer.
Almost like they needed a fight, needed to believe these Lakota were dangerous to justify being there, to live up to that whole Wild West myth.
That's a really interesting point. The podcast touches on that too, how these soldiers were products of their time, raised on stories that fueled their prejudice and fear.
Makes you wonder how much of history is shaped by those kinds of narratives.
It's a question worth thinking about, and in this case, those narratives had deadly consequences. Colonel Forsyth, the commander, orders the Lakota to hand over their weapons.
But many of them were reluctant, weren't they? They'd hidden guns, rifles, these last symbols of their power, their identity.
Yes. And Forsyth, frustrated, orders his men to search the Lakota, their belongings. You can feel the tension escalating. These soldiers, fueled by alcohol and prejudice, now literally invading the Lakota space.
Like a powder keg about to explode.
And then it does. Amidst all the chaos, there's a deaf Lakota warrior, Black Coyote. He refuses to give up his rifle. A struggle, and the gun goes off.
One gunshot in that situation changes everything.
Absolutely pivotal. Whether it was an accident or intentional, it's still debated. But the result was instant and horrific. An Army scout yells, "They're shooting! They're shooting!" And Forsyth loses control, orders his men to open fire.
And just like that, a surrender turns into a massacre.
The soldiers, many firing their guns for the first time, just unleash this torrent of bullets. Men, women, children, all mowed down.
Horrific. They even used those Hotchkiss guns, didn't they? Basically early machine guns.
They did. The Lakota who had weapons tried to fight back, but they were completely outmatched. The podcast talks about them trying to flee, running into a ravine, but those machine guns just cut them down.
They weren't even given a chance. No chance to surrender, to plead for their lives.
And Bigfoot, he's shot in the back, killed as he lay helpless. His daughter, rushing to his side, also shot and killed.
It's just heartbreaking. The cruelty. It's so different from Custer at the Washita Massacre. He at least tried to stop his men from killing women and children. Was there any restraint shown at Wounded Knee?
Sadly, no. The podcast really emphasizes that it was indiscriminate killing. Soldiers shooting anyone who moved, even children crawling out of the ravine. There's this chilling story about a private finding 2 babies alive amidst all the carnage.
2 babies. Alive. It's hard to even fathom.
He tries to carry them to safety, but a sergeant stops him, orders him to smash their brains out against a tree so they won't grow up to fight them.
That's pure evil. Those babies being spared seems like the only tiny glimmer of humanity in all that darkness.
It's haunting. And the final toll. Devastating. Out of 350 Lakota there, nearly 300 were killed. So many of them women and children.
Their bodies dumped into a mass grave. A chilling testament to what happened that day.
It really highlights the dehumanizing power of prejudice and fear. Those soldiers didn't see individuals, mothers, fathers, children. They saw the enemy, obstacles to be eliminated.
What was the reaction to this? From the government. Surely there were consequences.
It was a mixed bag. General Nelson Miles, who'd been leading the campaign against the Lakota, was appalled, called it an abominable criminal military blunder. demanded a full inquiry. Someone had to be held accountable, he thought.
So at least some within the military recognized the horror of it. What about the government itself? Did they share his outrage?
Not really. Public opinion was shaped by those initial reports from journalists embedded with the troops. Reports that painted the Lakota as the aggressors, the massacre as a justifiable victory.
It's amazing how the narrative can be twisted to justify such acts.
The Secretary of War even praised the 7th Cavalry for their skill, coolness, discretion, and forbearance. Said their conduct reflected the highest possible credit upon the regiment.
Unbelievable. Praising the men who carried out that massacre. What about Colonel Forsyth, the one who gave the order to fire? Was he held accountable?
Despite Miles's anger, the clear evidence. Forsyth was cleared of any wrongdoing by a military inquiry. The massacre at Wounded Knee, it effectively ended the Ghost Dance movement, marked the final chapter in the government's campaign to subdue the Lakota.
So despite the carnage, the injustice,
Yeah,
no real consequences for those responsible.
a bitter truth. And a reminder that history is often written by the victors. Those in power can shape the story, even when it comes to something as horrific as Wounded Knee.
But as you said earlier, the story doesn't end there. The legacy of Wounded Knee and the Lakota people's resilience continues.
Exactly. And in our final part, we'll explore that. How the Lakota navigated the aftermath of this tragedy, how they held on to their culture and identity, and how they continue to fight for justice and recognition.
We've spent the last 2 parts really digging into some tough stuff.
It's hard to imagine anything positive coming out of something like Wounded Knee.
It's true.
But like we've been saying, the Lakota story doesn't end there.
Right. So what happened after? How did the Lakota people navigate life after this?
Well, many of them, including those Ghost Dance leaders, were grappling with this huge defeat.
Trying to survive in a world that had been completely upended.
Exactly.
Did they just resign themselves to life on the reservation?
For some, assimilation was the only path they saw.
Adopting European customs, converting to Christianity.
Trying to blend in.
But others fought to hold on to their traditions.
Their language, their stories, their spiritual beliefs.
That must have been incredibly difficult.
It was. And many Lakota resisted assimilation in various ways.
They kept practicing their ceremonies in secret, passing down their language and stories to younger generations.
And they fought for their rights through legal channels and activism.
So that spirit of resistance, that refusal to be erased, it continued even after Wounded Knee.
It did. The human spirit is incredibly resilient.
And for the Lakota, their culture, their identity, those were far too precious to just let go of.
Absolutely.
The podcast mentioned some Lakota even joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. That seems a bit strange, considering how exploitative those shows were.
It is a complicated thing.
I guess for some, it was a way to survive.
To make a living when their traditional ways of life had been disrupted.
To adapt to their new reality?
Exactly.
But it was also more than just that, wasn't it?
It was. For some, it was a chance to share their culture with a larger audience.
To challenge the stereotypes that were out there.
And to assert their presence on a world stage.
It's almost like a form of resistance, in a way.
It was. Reclaiming their narrative, presenting themselves on their own terms.
The podcast tells this really powerful story about Kicking Bear.
The Ghost Dance leader.
He was imprisoned after Wounded Knee, but then joined Buffalo Bill's show.
He toured Europe, performed in these reenactments of the battle.
Wow.
And then, on the last night of the tour in Glasgow, Kicking Bear stayed on stage after the performance.
What happened?
He started speaking to the audience in Lakota.
Wait, so he was talking to this European audience in a language they couldn't understand?
Yes.
Why would he do that?
It's thought that he was trying to tell his side of the story.
To share the truth about Wounded Knee, about the Lakota experience.
A truth that was being silenced and twisted.
Wow. That's an incredibly powerful image.
It is. His words might not have been understood literally, but his act of defiance speaks volumes.
It shows that even in defeat, even when the odds are stacked against you, you can still find ways to resist, to keep your story alive.
Exactly. And that story, it continues to resonate today.
Wounded Knee is a symbol of the injustice that happened.
A reminder of the tragic consequences of colonialism, of cultural clash.
But it's also a testament to the strength of the Lakota people.
They continue to fight for their rights, their land, their heritage.
So even though they were defeated militarily, their spirit, their story, it lives on.
It challenges the dominant narrative.
Reminds us that history is never truly over, that the past shapes the present.
The podcast ends with a quote from Frederick Jackson Turner, this prominent historian.
What did he say?
He declared that with the closing of the American frontier, The first period of American history had come to an end.
But for the Lakota, and for so many other Native American tribes, it wasn't the end at all.
Not even close. Their story was far from over.
It's like Turner's Declaration just ignores their ongoing struggle, their very existence.
It does. And it reminds us that history is never linear, never truly complete.
There are always multiple perspectives, multiple stories waiting to be heard.
It's our responsibility to listen to those stories, to learn from them, and to challenge the narratives that try to silence them.
So why does all of this matter to us today? Why should we care about events that happened over a century ago?
Because the story of Sitting Bull and Wounded Knee isn't just some historical curiosity.
It's a reflection of the struggles for justice and recognition that are still happening today.
It forces us to confront the legacy of colonialism, the impact of cultural clash.
And to understand and respect different perspectives.
It reminds us that history is about people.
Their stories, their struggles, their triumph.
We need to acknowledge the past, learn from it, and work towards a more just and equitable future.
And it challenges us to think critically about how history is presented.
Whose voices are amplified, whose stories are marginalized or silenced.
We need to seek out multiple perspectives.
Challenge the dominant narratives.
And engage in meaningful dialogue about the complexities of the past.
Exactly.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It's been a heavy but important conversation.
It has.
As you continue exploring this history, keep this in mind. The ghost dance shirts worn by the Lakota believed to be bulletproof. They failed to protect them.
They did.
But maybe their story, their resistance, their very spirit has become a different kind of shield.
A shield against forgetting.
The shield against forgetting.
That's a powerful thought.
It is.
The Lakota people's story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the importance of remembering, and to the fight for justice and recognition.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.